Hi, my name is Seth Thompson, and I'm a Hampshire College student. This is the second video in my mini lecture series on Amazonian dark earths. This time I'm focusing on the archaeological context of Amazonian dark earths. And hopefully this will tie in the soil chemistry and help us understand what they mean for human occupation of the landscape. Hope you enjoy. So before we get into the archaeological context of ADEs, we have to talk about the history of Amazonia as a whole, and South America as a continent. And Amazonian dark earths are pre-Columbian human soils. They're just completely associated with pre-Columbian occupation of the Amazon. And the thing about historic accounts of the Amazon until very, very recently within scholarly work is that it was often said that the environment was this massive limiter to human occupation, and that, Amazonian societies had no way of reaching like stereotypically Western ideals of civilization back in the time. And that was because we didn't see the evidence of occupation in the same ways that we saw evidence of occupation in Europe. And, the history of archaeology and ecology, well, specifically historic ecology as tools of empire, has really shrouded this narrative of the past. But the reality is that human societies, pre-Columbian human societies, were extensive. And they engaged with extensive agriculture. Some of them lived sedentary lifestyles. Some of them lived nomadic lifestyles. Like any group of people, there's a lot of variation. And we can fall into the trap of really kind of creating this mythic world where the people exist in extremes, the environment exists in extremes. And it's just not true. And I really hope that through this video series, you start to see that Amazonian dark earths show that the complexity of life in the Amazon. And so I guess the first big thing about Amazonian dark earths in their archaeological context is that you have the chemical background that they show all these signs as being distinct from adjacent soils chemically, but also when we're looking archaeologically, we'll see that it's terra preta because of the buildup of organic matter, because they're typically very dark earth, and also the sheer amount of pottery sherds that we can find in it. And that's typically what tells an archaeologist that they've found Amazonian dark earth. It's that the pottery sherds, it's the vegetative carbon, it's intense signs of human occupation in the past. And one really irrelevant but cool tidbit of information there is that the history of ceramics, you can trace ceramic styles to different time periods. And so when you're analyzing Amazonian dark earths as an archaeologist and you're finding pottery sherds and stuff, you can kind of gauge how old the site is looking at those pottery sherds. And other things as well. You don't want to just base your analysis off of that, and ideally if you could get organic shit to carbon date, you can kind of correlate that with the history of the soil. But archaeologically speaking, Amazonian dark earths can be very, very deep, like 10 meters deep kind of thing, and they're associated with human occupation spatially. Like, the important thing to understand for archaeology is it's all about spatial analysis, visual spatial analysis. And so I drew some pictures to show you to kind of get the idea down. And if you remember from the first video, Amazonian dark earths exhibit changes chemically based on various things, and spatially within one site there can be so many varying chemical compositions of the Amazonian dark earth. And an archaeologist can kind of explain why. So here's a crappy drawing of an archaeological site, and I can't tell if it's backwards. That says archaeological site. This says housing area. This says communal area. This says trashman, and this says earthworks. And the point of this is, so this is one site. When you're studying a site, you can see varying chemical composition. Like, the chemical composition would change based on the activity of that area. So you're going to see changes in the chemical composition, the microbial activity, all of that by earthworks. You're going to see changes based on living area. You're going to see changes based on communal areas. You'll probably see less or more, depending on like how that communal space was used. You could see less or more buildup of Amazonian dark earths, and especially around trash bins, you'll get a lot of it. You'll get a lot of the nutrients because of the nature of pre-Columbian societies. And so you could potentially track what they were throwing away there based on analysis. You can study food residue on pottery to tell you what they were eating, the pottery that you are finding in the dark earth. So spatially, those differences can be explained by the type of activity. And it's the pottery, and it's those spatial differences at sites of known occupation that tell us that Amazonian dark earths are anthropogenic soils. We still haven't really agreed upon, like in the scholarly community, whether or not like these were intentionally made or if it was just kind of this byproduct of habitation. I personally take the stance that Amazonian dark earths most likely started building up just as a byproduct, and then after long-term occupation, which was actually quite common in pre-Columbian Amazonia, you started getting people recognizing these changes in the soil and that certain soil is this familiar. And so you have an added layer of like humans intentionally doing things to increase soil fertility, but like the formation of the soil itself, I personally would take the stance from my research thus far that like humans weren't like creating it. We can't like reduce nature to an equation and recreate it just yet, nor should we. But you can show that. Then an important aspect is you can get really down to a really micro level with the spatial analysis. And so I drew a little, basic map of a house. So you have the entrance up here, you have a fire pit in the middle, you have people sleeping in here, you kind of have your backyard area, and you'd probably have a trash bin in your backyard, right? And you can tell differences, like for example, you'll have a lot more biochar in a fireplace area where they were doing cooking. And you would have different types of chemical compositions based on what they were cooking and on that, but like the chemical composition of the fireplace is going to be different because of the fire, because of the temperature, than like the trash bin, where you might have more varied, because like the fireplace would just be for cooking, but like a trash bin could take up any number of things, human feces, urine, etc., but also food and other like, waste products of building houses and stuff. And so you can really track these differences, like down to a really tiny level archaeologically. But really, what Amazonian dark earths can really share with us through further research, especially when we're taking into consideration these chemical variances, is, how were humans living? How were people interacting with the environment? Because we have such a limited lens, because it's the past and we're interpreting the past. It's really just guesswork, methodological guesswork, but guesswork nonetheless. And it's really important because, again, like the chemical nature of Amazonian dark earths can help us with a lot of solutions. It can inform us with farming practices of indigenous people back, in pre-Columbian society. And like, it can tell us a lot about, since it's a carbon sink, it can help inform us about how we might utilize the earth itself to help us with waste management, and climate change and sustainable agriculture. But again, like, to do that research, we really have to be looking at it in the context of the history of South America and of the Amazon and its people. And that's the beauty of archaeology, I believe, personally, because we're really contextualizing it. We're not trying to like make it universal. It's really about the place and time of its creation. And so if we're taking into account these variances of chemical activity versus that, I think we could really learn a lot, but that's going to, involve the chemists and the soil scientists and the archaeologists really beginning to work together, all these people, and trying to see where their information can connect and create this, more extensive narrative of space and time. And one thing I kind of glossed over earlier was how the soils are specifically associated with pre-Columbian society. Part of the reason why we know that is in post-Columbian societies, where you started having the indigenous population levels dropping off drastically from like the large sizes they were because of diseases that were brought in, but also the horrors of colonialism. There are so many factors that influence that process, but because you had a reduction in the intensity of human occupation, we see that drop off of soil formation. Like, we can see that there are less and less soil, Amazonian dark earth soils associated with these areas that are like post-Columbian and like post-contact. Which offers, again, that unique lens, because like if they're dropping off and if it's heavily correlated with intense human occupation, is, you know, in what ways were people impacting the environment? And we have to get over this idea of the noble savage, of like, you know, people were not, you know, indigenous peoples weren't having an impact on the environment. It's a different impact than like the modern day impact of industrial agriculture and all of these things. It was an impact, and we have to keep in mind that research of Amazonian dark earths is really limited if we're thinking of it in like a Western context. We have to be thinking of it in a more broad way. And, you know, there's differences in Amazonian dark earths in the terra firma, which is the uplands, versus like terra firma in the floodplains. And there's wonderful, I can't find the link to it, but there's this wonderful article about spatially mapping through GIS, geographic information systems, the location of Amazonian dark earths. And if you can correlate that with different sites, it could tell us so much about human history. But again, the main point of Amazonian dark earths in an archaeological context is that Amazonian dark earths, even though they're very like chemistry and geological aspect, can tell us so much about human occupation. And it's just about asking the right questions and doing the right research before we gain a more thorough understanding. And it's always ongoing, and there's always research. And a lot of the research currently archaeologically is conducted like partially with ethnographic methods, studying peoples whose current lifeways are probably, to our best guess, very similar to what they might be in pre-Columbian society. And that can tell us a lot about, you know, those things. And the soils themselves take on different meanings for who's there. So like Amazonian dark earth has a very specific use for, say, you are an industrial farming executive, you know, at Monsanto, and you want to be able to be producing a lot of crops, versus like a small farmer, like small scale business farmer, versus like indigenous people. They're all going to have this different experience with the uses of Amazonian dark earths. And the beauty of archaeology is, you know, understanding that, you know, spatial awareness. It could tell us a bit about what it meant in the past as well as the present, if we're, you know, combining the right methods. That's all I have to say about the archaeological context of Amazonian dark earths. I'm probably going to continue to update this crash course, as this is partially what I really want to study while I'm here in Hampshire College. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments, and I'll try and do video responses with the proper research and keep my bibliography updated. Thank you.